Hello and welcome to a new installment of IVD North America webinars. Today we will discuss the QMS requirement of the new European IVD regulation and how those requirements interact with the ISO 1345-2016 version. My name is Julien Sénac and I'm a Certification Project Manager and IVD Technical Documentation Assessor here at IVD North America. Throughout this webinar, we will first explore the QMS requirements for manufacturers that are introduced by the new IVDR and the correlation with the requirement of the ISO 1345-2016 standard. Then, we will review the QMS expectation linked to the conformity assessment under the IVDR. And then finally, we will see how the ISO 1345-2016 does apply and the impact of the regulation on this application for importers, distributors, and authorized representatives. So, without further ado, let's explore the QMS requirement introduced by the new IVDR. In the new European IVD Regulation, the Article 10 covers the general obligation of the manufacturer. Among those obligations, the legislator included QMS requirements, which are presented in Section 8. The first paragraph of Section 8, which is presented here, states that the manufacturer shall establish, document, implement, maintain, keep up to date, and continually improve a quality management system, and it also adds the notion of risk in the implementation of processes related to the quality management system. This clearly correlates with the intent of the new version of the ISO 1345 to have a risk-based approach, and you can find this emphasized of those principles in section 4.1.1 and 4.1.2b. As you can see, the organization shall document a quality management system and maintain its effectiveness, and the organization shall apply a risk-based approach to the control of the appropriate processes needed for the quality management system. The second paragraph of that section 8 specifies that the quality management system shall cover all parts and elements of the manufacturer organization dealing with the quality of processes, procedures, and devices. In other words, the regulation requires the manufacturer to take into account all aspects of its organization and the life cycle of the device in the development of its QMS. This notion is also found in the ISO 1345-2016 version, in which the standard called for the organization to take into account its role when establishing the quality management system processes, and this is presented in section 4.1.2a. The new IVD regulation is known to be more prescriptive, and in the third paragraph of the section 8 of Article 10, we can find a list of aspects that the QMS have to address. So we will go through this list and see which section of the ISO 1345-2016 version discuss the same aspect of the QMS. The first aspect is closely related to the regulatory compliance and specifically to the conformity assessment and modification of the devices, for example, design changes, and how to maintain regulatory compliance after those changes. The first section is not covered by the ISO 1345-2016 version and is specific to the European regulation. So even if the manufacturer has successfully transitioned to ISO 1345-2016, the QMS may have to be updated to be in compliance with the new IVD regulation. The second aspect is related to identification of applicable general safety and performance requirements and the exploration of options to address those requirements. This is linked to section 7.3.3 of the ISO 1345-2016, which covered design and development inputs, and where it is clearly noted that those inputs should include functional, performance, usability, and safety requirements according to the intended use of the device. Another requirement of the QMS is to cover responsibility of the management. And this requirement is also found in Section 5 of the ISO 13485, which is entitled Management Responsibilities. The following requirement mandated by the regulation is related to resource management, including the selection and control of suppliers and subcontractors. We can find those elements in two sections of ISO 13485, which is first Section 6.1, related to provision of resources required to be able to implement the QMS and maintain its effectiveness, as well as answering the applicable regulatory and customer requirements. And the second one is Section 7.4.1, related to the purchasing process and the selection and control of supplier. Such control have to be proportionate to the risk associated with the medical device. Again, here we see the risk-based approach. And talking about risk, the risk management, as it is set out in Section 3 of Annex 1 of the European Regulation, it's to establish, implement, document, and maintain a risk management system with risk management plan for each product and throughout the life cycle of the device. This requirement is covered also by two sections, the Section 4.1.2, which called for a risk-based approach of the QMS, and the Section 7.1, which is related to the planning of the product realization. And this planning integrates risk management process for the realization of the medical device. The regulation also called to include aspects of performance evaluation in the QMS. This is directly related to Section 7.3.7 of the ISO 13485-2016 on design and development validation, which require the organization to perform this performance evaluation of the medical device in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. Here we see that we need to have procedure in place and documented where you would have the acceptance criteria, the method used to do the validation of design and development, which will come with the performance evaluation requirements of the regulation. The product realization. Product realization, which is planning, design, development, and production and service provision. I want to be clear here. It's a product, could be physical, but it can also be service, is directly related to the ISO Section 7, which called for product realization and also keep the same notion of product as a physical product or just a service. So here, your QMS should have process and procedures and documented records for the production and the realization of this product. The UDI. The UDI is a new requirement of the regulation. We see that it has to be done in accordance with Article 24 and the validity of information provided in accordance with Article 26. And this, even if it's a new requirement of the regulation, finds its correlation in Section 7.5.8 of the ISO 1345-2016 version, which require documented procedures for product identification. So here again, we have a requirement and we would have procedures in place to be sure that we will provide the right product identification. The regulation also called to cover aspects related to post-market in the QMS. In this section is correlated to the section 8.2.1 and 8.5.1 of the ISO 1345-2016 version. So 8.2.1 is related to feedback. It clearly mentioned in that section that if applicable regulatory requirement require the organization to gain specific experience from post-production activity, the review of this experience should form part of the feedback process. The other section, section 8.5.1, related to improvement of the QMS and for which the result of the post-market should be taken into account to maintain effectiveness of the quality management system. The inclusion of elements related to the communication with competent authorities, notified body, and other stakeholder in the QMS is also covered in the ISO 1345-2016 in section 7.2.3, which cover communication with customer-related process, and in section 8.2.3 related to documented procedures for providing notification to competent authorities. In this case, there is not much to add than whatever communication is required to be done to competent authorities, to notified body, to economic operators, importers, distributors, to customers, or any other stakeholder you may have, need to have a documented procedures in respect to your QMS, but also to the regulation of the European IVDR. The process for reporting serious incident and the field safety correction in the context of vigilance is also covered by section 8.2.3, but also by section 8.2.2, which is related to the documented procedures of complaint handling. So again, here we see the correlation. The communication, which is 8.2.3, and in this case of serious incident, you see we have a communication, maybe to competent authority, to notified body, to different elements depending on the incident. But we also have these procedures of collecting this information, and this is in the complaint handling in section 8.2.2. Now, when we get complaint, we also have to manage sometimes corrective and to do preventive actions and to verify if those actions are effective. Well, these have to be in the QMS as the IVDR requires it now, but you can still see it in the ISO 13485-2016 version in two sections as well, 8.5.2 and 8.5.3. These two documentation require documented procedure to identify and implement corrective action for 8.5.2 and preventive action for 8.5.3. The last element that the regulation called for in section 8 of Article 10 is the monitoring and measurement of output and product improvement. And this is directly related to the entire section 8. This section 8 is entitled Measurement, Analysis, and Improvement. You can see here the keywords are there. It's all the processes, all the documented procedures, and according with the ISO 1345 maintaining of the records that need to be included in your QMS by the ISO, but it's also now required written by the European IVDR. So as you can see, a lot of requirements of the regulation related to the QMS are also requirements of the new version of the ISO 13485 standard. So for a lot of you, it might not be affecting the change that you are making now. But be careful, as said earlier, some changes are very specific to the European IVD regulation. So these elements would have to be taken into account. So let's move now to the second section of this talk, which is to talk about the relation between the requirement of the regulation and the ISO 1345-2016 in the aspect of the conformity assessment, when that conformity assessment is based on Annex 9 and on the quality management system as well as the technical documentation. Here, I won't talk about the technical documentation, but I will just focus on the part of the quality management system. So in Annex 9 and Chapter 1, you have Section 1. And Section 1 states that the manufacturer shall establish, document, and implement a quality management system as described in the Article 10, Section 8, which we just reviewed, and maintain its effectiveness throughout the life cycle of the devices concerned. The manufacturer shall ensure the application of the quality management system as specified in Section 2, and shall be subject to audit as laid down in Section 2.3 and 2.4, and to surveillance as specified in section 3. So I won't talk about section 3 for the surveillance here, but I will talk about section 2 as this is brought up. Section 2 is divided in subsection. As mentioned above, you have 2.3 related to audits, and you have 2.4 related to notification of substantial changes that you would have to make to your notified body. And the 2.1, which is the one related to the first time or to the time that you apply to application for the assessment of the QMS to your notified body. So the first one is really how you would apply for this assessment. The 2.3, the 2.4 are on-site audit performed after application and the notification of change when change happen. And the middle one, 2.2, is the implementation of the QMS. And this is what I want to focus on now. So section 2.2, as mentioned before, called for the implementation of the quality management system. And such system should ensure compliance with the IVD regulation and have an obligation of documentation of procedures and of quality management system, which should be systematic and orderly and usually prepared under the form of a quality manual or written policies and procedures, but also have to include quality plan, quality records, and any other elements that need to be documented as part of the quality management system. Those elements are also found in the ISO 13485-2016 standard in two sections. The section 4.2.1, which is basically the general documentation requirement, and the section 4.2.2 related to the quality manual. And in the ISO standard, it is also clear that quality manual and quality procedures need to be documented and maintained. So these two elements are a perfect correlation, where you have the implementation of the QMS need to be documented, need to have a quality manual, need to have procedure in place and written and recorded. And these two sections here in the ISO covered that section 2.2. Section 2.2 of the regulation is also very prescriptive and clearly mentions what the documentation that is submitted for conformity assessment need to contain. These include the manufacturer quality objective. This quality objective is also a notion that you find in section 4.2.1 of the ISO 13485-2016, where it has to be documented for the QMS. The other part is the organization of the business. These include organization structure and responsibilities in correlation with section 5 of the ISO on management responsibilities. And you also have the method of monitoring the QMS efficiency and subcontractor. And this is linked to two sections, section 7.4 and section 8. The section 7.4 of the ISO is applicable to subcontractor because it's related to purchasing. And it clearly says in this section that you need to have established criteria for the evaluation and the selection of suppliers. And technically, the subcontractor, in this case, you will have to develop criteria for the evaluation of the subcontractor based on its ability to answer the organization requirements, so what you ask from him, but also based on their performance. And these criteria have to be based on a risk-based approach. Again, they would have to be proportionate to the risk associated with the medical device. So now, think about it, how for your subcontractors and all the suppliers, you have determined the evaluation and selection criteria and see are they risk-based and do they match. Regarding the monitoring of the QMS, this is directly related to section 8 because section 8 is calling for monitoring, analysis, and improvement. And this clearly calls for a monitoring plan and all the processes and procedures to put in place to maintain the effectiveness of the QMS. Another very important element, and here I will read exactly word for word what it says in the regulation in this section 2.2, is where the manufacturer does not have a registered place of business in a member state, the draft mandate of the designation of an authorized representative and a letter of intention from the authorized representative to accept the mandate need to be provided. In other words, if you're a manufacturer not located in Europe, you need to have this section. But do you have it in your ISO QMS right now? No, or maybe not, because this is not covered in the ISO 1345 2016 version. So here again, if you're established outside the European Union, be careful to have all the process, and in this case, the documentation, and these two pieces of documentation are clearly stated here in the document that you will submit to show the assessment of the quality management system following Annex 9 of the regulation. Another set of documents that you have to provide is the procedures and technique for monitoring, verifying, validating, and controlling the design of the device, as well as all the corresponding documentation and data, records, and everything linked to the implementation of these procedures and techniques. And this specifically should cover the strategy for regulatory compliance, including processes for identification of legal requirements and all other elements. This section is not covered in the ISO 1345-2016. So here again, in the documentation, when you are getting ready, that you have your QMS, you have implemented your QMS, you believe everything is fine, just be sure that every single section of the IVDR are covered. Because even if ISO 1345-2016 version is a very good base for your QMS, some elements might not be covered, and you need to be sure that these processes are included in it to answer the European regulation. Another element to provide is the documentation related to verification and quality assurance technique processes and procedures at the manufacturing stage, with the emphasis on sterilization process. Those are requirements that you can also find in the ISO in section 7.5 and 8.2.6. The section 7.5 is related to production and service provision and cover all aspects of the product manufacturing and validation, but also have some particular requirements for sterile products. One, for example, is the maintenance of records of sterilization process parameters for each sterilization batch. The second, 8.2.6, is a section related to monitoring of product and call for documented procedures to verify that the product requirements have been met. So in both cases, you would have to have the procedures in place to answer what the regulation wants, but also what you can maybe find in the ISO. The last element that is written here in section 2.2 and need to be provided is the appropriate test and trial which you would carry out in order to ensure, so usually what we call that in-process control or final control, and basically how, where, and with what those tests are done. And we strongly emphasize on traceability of calibration of the equipment used for the test. In the ISO 1345-2016, we find three sections that is related to these elements, are section 7.4.3, which call for establishment and implementation of the inspection of purchased products. And this applies for the manufacturing stages, for example, that are subcontracted. You can also find it in section 7.6 related to the control of monitoring and measuring equipment. And I would like here to emphasize that this section, the 7.6, calls for documented procedures for the validation of the application of computer software used for the monitoring and measurement of requirements. So we are above the software itself to be validated. Now we're talking that in this section, you need to show which test, but also with the ISO, the validation of the software used, for example, on the equipment that will do the monitoring. So it is important to identify the equipment and the software, including their version. Like version of the software is very important to maintain a proper traceability as it is required above. So the last section of the ISO that cover this last point is the 8.2.6 again, and these clearly call and require the identification of test equipment used to perform measuring activities. So, between the Article 10, Section 8, And this Annex 9, the regulation have provided clear requirements for the QMS of a legal manufacturer, and that some of those elements are closely related to the requirement of the ISO 13485. Now, ISO 13485-2016 is not strictly restricted to legal manufacturer, and it also applies to authorized representative, importers, and distributors. Now, let's try to see how this would impact with the IVDR. Here, when we look at ISO 13485-2016, the section 4.1 called the organization to have a quality management system and maintain its effectiveness in accordance to the requirement of the ISO, but also applicable regulatory requirements. Same thing, he asks for establishment, implementation of any requirement procedures or any of his activity based on the standard and the applicable regulatory requirements. But more importantly, here is the key, is organizations should determine the processes needed for the quality management system and the application of these processes throughout the organization, taking into account the role undertaken by the organization. So here you see the link. The ISO 13485 say that doesn't matter the role you have to take that role and implement a QMS depending on what the ISO requires from you, but also what could be the applicable regulatory requirement. And here comes the European IVDR and the obligation for authorized representative found in Article 11, importers in Article 13, and distributors in Article 14. So in these cases, all of these stakeholder, I would say, of the EU IVDR will also have to see if some of the requirement of the IVDR they have in those articles, 11, 13, or 14, needs to have specific procedures in place to answer from their QMS what the ISO 13485 call, which is any applicable regulatory requirement and processes that need to follow, and will also answer the European regulation. So as you can see, even if there is a clear correlation for the manufacturer, all stakeholders of this new EU IVDR would have to think their QMS that way. So in conclusion, the ISO 13485-2016 is a good base to answer quality management system requirement for the IVDR. The manufacturer have to ensure that all European requirements are answered by the QMS. Again, remember, some sections are not covered in the ISO 13485-2016. You may need to go back and check. And lastly, I just said it, but the ISO 13485 is applicable to the manufacturer for sure, but also to the authorized representative, importers, and distributors, and their requirements. So one more slide is how to prepare. Some people said it. So how to prepare, I like to say, like, right now, let's do a gap analysis. You have the current state, which is ISO 13485-2003, and you know the future, or maybe you already done that, is the ISO 13485-2016. And when you went from one to the other, you had to do a gap analysis, and from that gap analysis, you developed a plan and implemented this plan. But with the IVDR, it's pretty much the same thing. You would bring the IVDR or within your action plan that you are currently implementing and see how you can make this modification in process and procedures to achieve ISO 13485-2016 with the requirement of the IVDR. And then basically you do this analysis and the action plan. Now, if you're already at the end, which is ISO 13485-2016, then you have to go back and do a new gap analysis with the IVDR. And I hope that some of the information that we provided in this webinar will help you to jumpstart that process of doing your gap analysis and see how you can implement the European regulation and all the requirements of related to the QMS with the changes and the QMS that you have now under ISO 13485-2016. On that, I will thank you for your attention, and we will basically be able to answer any question you may have in the future. Thank you.